Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining me today. I am Tamsin, and today, with the help of the Liveries, I am going to be walking around the City of London and learning all about pollinators. So first of all, I am joined by Sue Green, who is a farmer but also the master of the worshipful company of Wax Chandlers. So Sue, thank you for having me today in this wonderful building. Can you please tell me more about the Wax Chandlers?
Well, very nice to meet you, Tamsin. Thank you for giving us such a wonderful welcome, and thank you for the compliment about our hall, which, just for those that don't know, we've been on this actual site for over 500 years. And I just want to show you our charter that was granted by Richard III in 1484. So we're very, very proud of that. It's our most precious piece, and I was very keen that we showed you it in the film.
Well, wonderful, thank you. But 1484, a long time ago. Mm-hmm. So what are you guys doing today in the present day?
Well, we like to consider ourselves as a forward-thinking livery company. Obviously, in the past, we've been related, our traditional trade has been to do with the honeybee and beeswax candles. And although they're absolutely beautiful today, and we do a lot to support things in that area, actually, where the honeybee, bumblebees, solitary bees, and all the other insects that rely on pollination, they have an urgent need for our assistance going forward.
So what are pollinators?
Well, there's a huge range of pollinators, but of particular interest to the wax chandlers, obviously, is the honeybee, which has only one. Also, there are lots of bumblebees. There were originally 24. 2 are already extinct, which is tragic, and there are a few more that are in the sort of dangerous category. And solitary bees, there are about 220 different types of solitary bees. I'm not sure about hoverflies or the beetles or moths and butterflies, but you know, we all are aware of how our lovely pollinators are under threat. So at the Wax Chandlers, we feel that it's appropriate for us to be one of the people that should be flying the flag for this group of insects. We are working hard to make this a long-term strategy within the Square Mile. We're involving other livery companies as well, such as the Gardeners Company. That's sort of on the traditional history of the livery world, but also the more modern livery companies, such as the information technologists. And we've also started having conversations with other organisations, such as the Bumblebee Conservation Trust. So that's all very exciting. It'd be very easy to run before we can walk, but we want to concentrate on the Square Mile, or maybe a little bit beyond it, but principally the Square Mile, because the livery world is absolutely ingrained in the Square Mile. And if you look at the 110 livery companies that exist, there are about 40,000 people that are involved in the livery world. So it doesn't mean everyone works in the city, but they might be linked to their trade throughout the country or even overseas. So, you know, by using this network of livery companies, actually, and the focus on the Square Mile, actually we can extend it much, much further. But let's start off with a small focus, get it right, and move on after that.
So we're focusing in, first of all, on this 1 square mile, the original Londinium, these Roman walls. So why this area, and what can we do in such a built-up area in the City of London?
Yeah, well, we can do lots. Absolutely. You've got all sorts of greening ideas that one can do for pollinators, because that's what pollinators need. They need flowers. And obviously these flowers have got to deliver pollen for as long a season as possible, because the pollinators have different needs depending on what type of insect they are. So the types of things one can think about are window boxes. That's very small scale, to much larger scale where you can have green walls or garden roofs. I did hear the other day that actually 30% of all buildings in the City of London have roofs strong enough for green gardens. So can you imagine the impact that would have on some pollinators? Obviously, pollinators operate at different heights, so we've got to think of what happens at ground floor level as well as very high up. So there's all sorts of things we can do, from improving our spaces, our green spaces in the city as well, you know, planting more grass, leaving some of that grass to grow wild. How about some wildflowers? You know, I know there's a garden close to our hall where there was an orchid in their wildflower meadow this year. And it's a tiny patch, it's no bigger than this room, but they had an orchid in it. So, you know, from little acorns grow large oak trees in concept, and that's why we've focused on here, and we have the support of many people within the city, I know.
So we've been spoken about these manicured, pristine lawns, but we really don't need to be putting in that much effort, do we? We can do this in any space.
Absolutely not. And this is what's so amazing about what, you know, as a gardener, how do we hate having weeds in the garden? But actually weeds are good for our pollinators. I'll talk to you about the red admiral and the peacock butterfly because they're absolutely fantastic. And interestingly, the peacock butterfly was the first one I saw this season, which was very exciting. They're quite rare nowadays, which is very sad. But what we need to do is focus on weeds for them because actually they love nettles, stinging nettles. So as a larvae. But once they pupate, they go to our famous butterfly tree, don't they? The buddleia. And guess what? Blackberries. But how many of you commute into London and you see those wonderful buddleias on the railway sidings and sort of you start to tut-tut and go, gosh, you know, couldn't they tidy it up a bit? But actually, that is perfect. My message to a lot of people who will be listening is that don't be frightened of messy because insects and pollinators have very different needs throughout the year, and the most important thing is we make sure that we've got the right environment for them, which Pollinating London is all about creating.
Thank you. And as A.A. Milne said, weeds are flowers too.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much for joining me today, and I look forward to catching up with you, and I'll be able to tell you all that I've learnt from the rest of the wonderful liveries that I'll be meeting today.
Fantastic. I look forward to hearing about it.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
So, I'm here actually at Barber Surgeons with Dr. Tim Cutler. So Tim, you're a master of the Barber Surgeons, a liveryman of the gardeners, and honorary curator of this garden, which is just excellent.
It was a huge honour, and it provides a means of my passion in historic medicinal plants. I can devote to this garden now, having been involved with the Chelsea Physic Garden for many years. This is now a nice self-contained garden that I can involve myself with, and I find if I have raised blood pressure, it certainly comes down when I walk into this garden. It's such an important open space.
It is, isn't it? So, I mean, it's really good for pollinators, but as you say, it's also, spaces like this good for people?
Are they good for people? I've been teaching for years how important open spaces and gardens are for good health. There's a guru in my life called Oliver Sacks,
yeah,
an English-trained neurologist who worked and taught in New York and wrote the most wonderful books. And he used to take his very seriously neurologically damaged patients into the New York Botanic Gardens.
Oh, really?
And he watched them get better. And he reckoned that gardens and music were more important than any drugs he prescribed. And he watched his patients with dementia, with Parkinson's disease, with debilitating long-term neurological illness, all get better. And patients who couldn't do their shoelaces up could do it. Put some seedlings in front of a patient and they knew what they were doing.
Yeah.
He was inspirational, and he was my sort of guru for how important open spaces and gardens are for long-term health. And I keep coming across new scientific papers in the press about showing reduction in mortality. I think what they call all-cause mortality.
Oh, right, yeah.
For people who experience outside life and gardens and open spaces. It's so important.
Yeah. And actually, through this period of the pandemic, I think it has made people appreciate so much more the green spaces, and where they haven't got green spaces, how dreadful it's
I
been
think it's
for
been a
them.
huge contrast.
Yeah,
And those of us who've been lucky enough to have gardens and spaces to go to have got through this terrible time
yeah,
much better
yeah.
than the
Definitely.
unfortunate people who've been confined to tower blocks or whatever and no open spaces.
Yeah.
I think it must have been the most dreadful 9 months.
Yeah, absolutely. So in this garden, you've got quite a lot of plants that are quite perfumed,
Yes.
which is good for pollinators. And do you think that makes a difference to people?
I think perfume, the scents of flowers are one of the principal benefits. And in this garden, we try to have a mix, but the history of perfumery is tied up with herbs, and plants were grown for medicinal purposes, and for scenting smelly Tudor houses,
Yeah,
and for perfumery. Perfumery is the essence of gardening as far as I'm concerned. The lavender is still in flower. I mean,
Yeah.
who can live without lavender in the garden?
yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
So the scent is all important to me. We have one rose in the garden, the apothecary's rose,
Yeah.
which is possibly the oldest cultivated rose in history.
Oh,
We think it goes back to the Persians in about the 12th century BC,
that's really good.
but it got its name through the apothecaries outside Paris, who created an industry of potpourri and perfumery and
Yeah.
confectionery with the essence of that rose. And it's sad that it only flowers once. It's a treasure in June and July, but there's nothing like it.
Yeah.
For me, that is the essence of a garden.
Thank you. I mean, that's just the essence of the value of gardens and green spaces for well-being, for health, for pollinators.
Yeah.
It's just wonderful, isn't
Yeah,
it?
and here we are, early September. We've got some tansy in flower.
Yeah.
The sedums are coming into flower,
Yeah.
and the
And-
butterflies and bees
Yeah,
will be
they're
on
gonna
that
love
shortly.
them, aren't they?
We've got pennyroyal in flower, all native plants, saponaria, the herb of grace, rue,
Oh yes, yeah.
still in flower,
Yeah.
and melilotus over there. So there's, quite a lot of gardens are actually slightly bereft of flowers at this time of year. And here we have a garden full of natives, and it's lovely.
It is lovely. And that's it. Actually, that's important for the pollinators as well, isn't it? Having something late season and
Yes.
early season.
We've got a bit of stachys finishing up there, coming to
You
the end
can
of its
see a
time.
bee on it now.
And yes, there's still something going on. So it's a joy. There's Teucrium, there's Clinopodium, they're still in flower. So we've got something going on for quite some time. I see city workers coming and sitting here and having
Yeah.
their lunch.
Yeah.
They escape from their
Yeah.
offices and come and enjoy this little open space and enjoy the garden and enjoy the history. We have the Roman wall around it.
Mm.
We probably had a garden here in about 1550. We know we had a garden here in 1550. We possibly had a garden here 100 years earlier,
Oh,
but records are sparse. So this garden has replaced quite a lot of ancient history, and it's lovely to see it continuing. It's a joy to come here.
excellent.
I think the COVID crisis and the lockdowns that we've all been under have highlighted for people really how important healthy, abundant nature is to our lives, and also the iniquities that are experienced in society as to who can readily access green spaces and nature and who can't. We've all seen the videos of dolphins playing in Trieste harbour and wild boar and their piglets trotting through the deserted streets of Berlin. There's really a newfound connection with nature that's been brought about in recent months. And I think that provides a perfect platform for governments to start looking at what policies are needed if we're to start piecing together the terribly depleted natural fabric of our country. I've been a passionate lover of nature all my life, since I can remember. And if you love nature, you can't help but notice that creatures of all kinds are becoming more scarce, that the natural tapestry of life in our country is becoming more threadbare. And it's always seemed to me that governments have not been serious about reversing those declines. We've had kind of tokenistic announcements and little gimmicks, but nothing serious until now. And it feels that on a global level, but also here at home, for the first time, governments are really genuinely serious about turning the tide. For example, if you look at the agriculture bill, which is going through Parliament at the moment, several £billion of agricultural subsidies handed out each year are now going to be contingent upon stewardship and healing of the natural world. Public money for public good is the term used to describe the policy, and it's going to be the biggest win for nature that we've ever seen. The fisheries bill similarly looks to restore the kind of abundance to our seas that our great-grandparents knew. The beauty of these things is that nature does recover very, very quickly if you give it a chance. So if you put the right incentives in place, people will respond and nature will bounce back very, very quickly. And the first fish catch they wrote in 1946 was 10 or 15 times greater than the last fish catch of 1938, after 5-6 years of no fishing in the English North Sea. So it strikes me that the time is right to start doing all of this. And I think that the iniquities exposed by the COVID crisis in respect of access to nature are now really apparent to people. We don't just need to restore nature out in the countryside. We need nature running through our lives, through our cities, around our cities. I mean, our green belts, for example, are pretty depressing. They may be green, but they're generally either intensive farms or golf courses, and people don't have access to them. So we really need to look at public access, and we need to look at actual landscape scale restoration of nature in and around our cities. And I think that's really about putting the incentives in place for people to do that. So the new public money for public good approach to rural payments, for example, could be used to encourage greenbelt farmers to restore woodland and provide the public with access to that woodland. And that's a perfect example of the kind of policy that could bring people back into contact with healthy nature in and around our cities. Anyone who's travelled to The Hague or Amsterdam, Rotterdam, any of those major Dutch cities will have noticed that nature is much more present in people's lives in those places. Rivers have been rewilded such that in the very centre of Amsterdam you have these extraordinary ribbons of water that are teeming with bird life and beavers building their lodges and their dams, and nature is really a part of everyday life, not just for rural people but for urban people. And I think it's quite simple to put in place not just incentives but also planning regulations and things that encourage the restoration of nature right at the heart of our cities. And I think we can learn a lot from continental Europe on that. Mexico City has come to the realization that if you incentivize people to have green roofs, in other words, flat roofs with vegetation on it, you actually lower the temperature and improve air quality across the whole city. So now the tax system in Mexico City is geared towards incentivizing that. So there's lots you can do both in terms of planning and through the tax system to encourage people to weave nature into the fabric of their own real estate. Richard Nixon once famously said that all American rivers should be fishable, swimmable and drinkable. And my own personal dream is that we should aspire to the same in all of our river systems. I mean, why shouldn't the Thames be clean enough to swim in it, at least? You know, try swimming in the Thames now and you'll probably get dysentery. You know, why shouldn't we aspire to a fishable, swimmable, drinkable Thames, which is rewilded and has beavers and has white-tailed eagles? You know, that's all perfectly possible and within our grasp. It's just a question of providing the right incentives to both local government and private companies, private individuals to do it. I think the most effective incentive is through the tax system. So lower taxes for people who build and manage their buildings in such a way as to encourage nature. I think you can do a lot through regulation, particularly in the planning system. I mean, I don't know if you've heard of a Swift brick, for example, but a Swift brick is a brick with a hole in it and it's hollow inside and it's perfect for swifts to nest in. And swifts, you know, ought to be screeching in vast numbers above London each summer, but they're not because of a shortage of nest sites. So a simple planning regulation saying that all buildings must have Swift bricks underneath their eaves, you know, would be the kind of thing that can make a massive difference. You know, I think Mexico City and Paris insisting upon greenery on every flat roof. You know, that's another innovation that is fantastic for pollinators and for nature. but also reduces temperatures across the city in the summer and improves air quality. So I think through the tax system, I think through the planning system and regulation, and then I think private markets are going to play an increasingly important role. For example, Wessex Water in Poole paying farmers further up the catchment to stop their use of nitrates and phosphates because it saves the water company money in extracting those chemicals from drinking water. I think we're going to see a lot more of that, and I think what's needed is for government to put in place the legal framework that enables those private markets to flourish.
Amazing. Do you think there's still a space for small grassroots companies like us to be pushing for that policy?
I think it was Margaret Mead, an American activist, who said, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world," and that's true. I think that there's a massive role for grassroots organisations pushing for policy change locally and nationally, creating projects, new protected areas, encouraging private businesses to do interesting things. I think that really they're the essential ingredient in all of this. In fact, everything good that I've ever seen happen in my lifetime has been brought about by the work of small groups of committed citizens in that way.
We are now here in the very colourful, if slightly drizzly, Postman Park with the former Environment Minister, Richard Benyon. Thank you for joining us. Richard, first of all, what are you up to now?
Well, I'm doing a number of things. I'm still doing quite a lot with the environment, one of which is I've become a trustee of a charity called Plant Life, promotes wildflowers. You know, one of the sort of great tragedies of our times is that we've lost 97% of wildflower meadows, and the disappearance of many natural pollinator species in our countryside means that sometimes our towns and cities are the most biodiverse places you can find.
That's incredibly strange to hear that it's actually the cities that are holding up this biodiversity. Do you think there's anything that we can do to save this massive loss of wildlife?
There's so much we can do in trying to manage our rural areas better, but there's also these places, our towns, our parks, our gardens, the green infrastructure in urban environments are so important, and creating that connectivity through cities like London and designing in pollinator species and thinking about biodiversity and the pyramidic effects about it. If you haven't got pollinators, you don't have anything. And it's so important. And that's why I think that what's happening in some boroughs, and certainly in the City of London, in their biodiversity action plan strategies is important, but it needs to be right across this huge global city that people come to. This can be an absolute beacon for biodiversity and for green infrastructure.
Amazing. So these strategies that you just mentioned, how are we, the public, able to really push for those to ensure that we get this across the whole city?
Well, there's a new, really exciting mood of green activism, and sometimes it's people say to me, and when I was an MP, they were saying, you know, rather than just shouting outside our, outside Parliament, I want to do something. Talk to your MP, talk to your local councillor. Boroughs have huge importance here, and get active and talk to the people who manage parks and say, what are you putting in that will support pollinators? And understanding the importance of those as part of the the plans for these areas, how parks are maintained. I mean, there are many parks which are mown within an inch of their life. They don't need to be. They can be areas where wildflowers and pollinator-friendly species can be encouraged. And there are parks. They're not the government's parks. They're not ministers' parks. Not councillors' parks. They belong to people who live and use this city. And we've got to take back ownership of them and really make sure they are thriving environments for wildlife.
Wow, yeah, the power really is with us then, I guess. That's amazing. So tell me more what you're doing with the Trust at the moment.
Well, the Plant Life is a charity which promotes plants. It has its own reserves, and it tries to inform policymakers about how to weave into its policies how governments how they will manage our environment in the future. And they're fantastic, but they've got very few resources. There are many other green NGOs that are doing things as well. And I now run a business that has residential and commercial property in London, and we're trying to have green roofs. We're trying to have as many beekeepers on as possible. We're trying to design in things like swift boxes in the eaves of buildings. And you know, I immediately am attracted to campaigns that are trying to encourage particularly on pollinator species. And pollinators need plants that are pollinator friendly, and that pyramid, if you're doing that for bees and other pollinators, you're supporting the whole pyramid of our biodiversity. And towns and cities like London can be such a driver in a sort of sink of biodiversity, which can then emanate back out into our depleted countryside,
Yes.
which hopefully is going to improve with new systems of rural policy which are coming through. You know, this is a really important time for us all. We mind desperately about our environment, and here's an opportunity for us to make sure everybody understands how passionately people feel about it.
Yeah, that's amazing. So we should be lobbying our MPs, talking to them, seeing these NGOs, and talking to people like you who are building these up within your own businesses
Yes.
and trusts.
Yes, and you know, for example, if you rent a house off a housing association, housing associations are not for profit. They're effectively public housing companies, and you know, what are they doing? What are they doing to protect green infrastructure? What are they doing to help the green open spaces that they manage? And talk to your local councillor. Councillors in London have enormous powers on this, and make sure that your local authority is joined up with those around it, and you're getting a cross-London strategy. And there's some wonderful examples of boroughs that are getting it right, and there's some others where they are a long way behind. But if you fly in a plane over London, you see it's a very green city compared to many others around the world. Let's make sure it's lots of green open space, but it's not always the best managed, and it could be so much better.
Well, thank you very much for joining us, and I hope that we'll see you soon and see these amazing parks return to their former pollinating glory.
Thank you.
Thank you.